Elder Scrolls Blades was a single-player dungeon crawler. It was made for smartphones, so it didn't look amazing graphics-wise, and its mechanics appropriately reflected an intentionally casual design that slowly ramped up the challenge. That makes sense. It was a side title meant to be played on your phone during a lunch break, not a mainline game from the Elder Scrolls series. This was not the first time the series had been made for mobile phones. From 2003 to 2006, Bethesda published 4 mobile games. From that era, you can guess that yes, they were flip phone games. The 4th mobile game was made for the Nokia N-Gage, which was an attempt to combine the appeal of the Game Boy with the functionality of a cell phone. The difference between these 4 mobile games and Blades? You can still play them. Yeah, despite being made for hardware that was so limited that different phones had to have different versions, with fewer features including cutout classes, these games still work and can be played 20 years later. Blades cannot, despite releasing in 2019. It's a shame. I don't think the game is amazing, but if you wanted a casual TES-themed dungeon crawler, you could do worse. But this game didn't fail. It was murdered. It was engineered to die, and the terms of service make that abundantly clear. This is not even the first Elder Scrolls mobile game to die. The combat of Blades is actually deeper than Oblivion and Skyrim, since there are wind-up attacks and combo moves. Okay, that's me being purposefully obtuse. Obviously, most of this game lacks the depth of even something like Skyrim. I guess if you wanted to sit around and get blackpilled about how casualized Elder Scrolls 6 could be, you could check this out. Sorry, you can't. You have to take my word for it, unless someone finds a way to revive it. Honestly, I do think this game would have a niche appeal in the long run, mostly as a curiosity. People make videos about Redguard and Battlespire. I'm sure there's an amazing Blades deep dive that could have been made in 10 years. Instead, most of its assets were carved up and sold as paid mods in Skyrim, and then they took the game behind the shed and killed it unceremoniously. Blades starts, of course, with a Thalmor agent attacking you before he unleashes his most devastating blow, the terms of service.
Pat wanted me to make a note that he meant to say EULA and not TOS in the previous section. There was a lot that could have, and did, go wrong with the Elder Scrolls Blades, what with this being a mobile game made by a studio that's not experienced in making them. However, I think that unfamiliarity is also what made Blades interesting. Bethesda took what they could from their tried and tested formula and distilled it into something that could actually work on phones. The result was a game that leaned into the dungeon crawling roots that have always been with the Elder Scrolls, and it worked surprisingly well. The game can be neatly split between 2 parts, dungeons and the town. We'll start in the town because that's typically where most players would go when starting a session. Like most other Bethesda games, the town would facilitate preparation for exploration and talking to NPCs. Yes, this is a game that had dialogue with NPCs, some of it even voice acted. The player got different dialogue options that would vaguely fall into Paragon and Renegade flavors. There were also quests, some of them with choices and consequences, with the main quest sprawling into several branches related to different characters and factions. Honestly, it would probably be the best structured main quest modern Bethesda has done with how neatly it tied into the other quest lines. Unfortunately, the mobile aspect meant players would be experiencing these quests 5 minutes at a time with potentially several real-life days between them, and yeah, no story is going to remain coherent when experienced like that. Still, it's surprising to see in a mobile game, so points for effort. The story goes, the player is a member of the Blades in Cyrodiil who just survived the Thalmor Purge. They decide to return to their former hometown, only to find that it had been razed to the ground by the Queen's mercenaries over unpaid taxes. Well, okay, technically the razing was an accident. Things got out of hand when one of the mercs smashed the giant statue of the founder. This released an ancient Iliad spirit known as Celamariel, who destroyed the town and took the form of a lich. Turns out Celamariel had been bound to the statue with an Elder Scroll because he wanted to destroy the world, and yada yada yada, the player needed to gather materials to redo the binding ritual and save the world. The stories in Blades were all super basic, even by Bethesda standards. Again, the way most people play mobile games would likely get in the way of any complex writing, so a Bethesda chosen one plot is what we got. What's weirder though is that despite having aliens, the Thalmor, dragons, blades, and everything else in this game, none of that got expanded upon in any way whatsoever in terms of lore. Without prior knowledge of the franchise, and specifically Skyrim and Oblivion, you'd be utterly lost in what's going on due to how little the game exposits. It's as if the game was written with the knowledge that it'd one day be deleted, and so it needed to be entirely self-contained with no lore implications for the franchise it exists within. It was funny seeing them try to shoehorn dragons into a game that predates Skyrim by 21 years. I'm not sure if they did this because dragons are iconic for Skyrim players, or if they were really just scraping the bottom of the barrel for ideas for what a game about the Blades would even entail. Outside of being a weekend dragonborn, the player would spend a lot of time dodging the inquiries of the Thalmor who were hot on their heels. That plotline just ended with the player killing the Thalmor agent that they'd been stringing along for like 10 quests. Yeah, surely that's not going to lead to a much more intentional raising of the town. No, not at all. Speaking of which, rebuilding the town was a mechanic that I'm surprised Bethesda committed to forcing players to interact with. Despite it making zero sense why I'd even be given the job, I did enjoy getting to play the role of town mayor. It was satisfying to watch the town slowly recover and repopulate as a direct result of my work. It was also neat getting to lay out the shops and houses how I wanted them. No longer at the mercy of Bethesda's town designers, I finally had the centralized commercial district of my dreams. I even enjoyed the optional decorating systems that had me choosing architecture styles and plopping decorations. Town building was like the best parts of player housing and settlement building from Bethesda's various games over the years, rolled into one neat little package. Honestly, I'd really like to see a refinement of this in TES VI. Rebuilding the town would earn it prestige, which would then contribute to the town's overall level. Each level unlocked respective upgrade levels for the different buildings. Upgraded shops offered better wares, increased vendor cash, and expanded crafting capabilities. Okay, it was possible to shirk your duties as town mayor and ignore the crafting systems. You'd just be unable to sell your loot, upgrade your gear, brew potions, and enchant items. Not at all an ideal way to play the game, probably not a fun way either, but it was possible if you were that against crafting systems. Personally, I liked the flexibility of the crafting systems provided. All of the crafting systems from Skyrim made a return, but a little smoother. The tempering system, for instance, was given more fixed quality tiers, with tempering allowing you to move the gear up to the next fixed tier. It wouldn't make that steel sword viable forever, but it would allow the player to get more mileage out of it if they like the enchantment on it or something. Man, it's crazy to think that this game predates Starfield. What I didn't like about these systems, though, were the artificial hindrances designed to test my patience and make me buy loot boxes and premium currency. Everything in town had timers. Constructing or upgrading buildings, tempering and enchanting equipment, even brewing potions. The timers started off reasonable enough, maybe a couple of minutes, more than enough time for me to go clear a dungeon or two and return to find my things done. But eventually I was seeing timers measured in hours, upwards of a day. Apparently these timers were way worse in earlier versions of the game, and yeah, that sounds pretty awful because these timers would slow down progression a lot. I would have play sessions where I would just have to close the game after a while because I was waiting on all of these timers. Now, in pretty much every Bethesda game since Oblivion, gating character progression wouldn't gate off story and quest progression because the worlds were level scaled. You could easily marathon the main quest of Skyrim, for example, because the systems were designed so that, in theory, the questline would provide the same level of challenge regardless of where your character's gear and levels are at. So of course this is the first Bethesda game since Morrowind to not have level scaling. I mean, it was still there a little bit, but it was tuned way down so that certain quests were just unbeatable if the player was below a certain level and equipment threshold. You could not marathon the main questline in Blades. Honestly, even if you'd paid your way through it with thousands of dollars in loot boxes, I still don't think it would be possible to get all the way to the end in a couple of real-life days. Mainly because you'd still have to grind XP to level up to unlock abilities, perks, and spells, because there was no way to buy your way through that progression. Loot was level scaled, but it was nowhere near as aggressive as Skyrim. As well, higher tiered items required higher character levels to use. Again, Bethesda rarely makes hard level or skill requirements for equipment. Like, the only game that comes to mind is Fallout 76, and that system vanishes after like 30 hours of playtime. My best guess is that they wanted to maintain some semblance of balance in a game with loot boxes. However, it is worth noting that loot boxes were also level scaled so that items would be within a couple levels above and below the players. Alright, let's talk about combat in dungeons. While it wasn't an exact copy, there was a lot of simplification between the games. The bones of Blades was unmistakably Skyrim. In certain regards, Blades was actually an improvement over Skyrim. For example, Skyrim's paddle spamming was ditched for a directional combat system where timing was critical and strategic thinking was rewarded. Things like weaknesses and resistances played a much bigger role in how combat would play out. Different weapon types were more than just personal preference, and even different armor types provided natural resistances to certain elements and weapons. These components would come together in a way that encouraged having different gear for different encounters, and there was even a custom loadout system for easily switching between setups. However, anything that didn't neatly fit this elaborate rock, paper, scissors paradigm was removed. For example, illusion and alteration spells. Actually, magic schools entirely were cut along with skills. Their replacements were 3 progression trees: magic, perks, and abilities. Magic is self-explanatory, while perks and abilities were passive and active combat skills respectively. There was no ranged combat, probably because there were no stealth mechanics. Well, I guess that's one way to kill the stealth archer meta. When combat would initiate, the player would be locked in place as the game switched to combat mode. A dedicated combat mode was pretty much essential for a 3D action combat game like this in order to make it accessible for anyone outside of Gen Alpha. Bethesda's rule of 3 has probably reached its zenith with this combat HUD. Magic mapped to the left side of the combat hotbar, abilities mapped to the right, with an awkwardly placed block button in the middle. The player had 6 hotkeys total, 3 for spells, 3 for abilities. Tapping the 3 vital bars beneath them would open menus for selecting spells, abilities, or consumables. Spells used magicka, abilities used stamina. Use a spell or an ability and it gets placed on cooldown. Cooldowns were essential for this combat system as it transformed the pace of combat into a game of deliberate offense and defense. Knowing when to attack and with what was just as important as knowing when to block or dodge. And I gotta give credit to the concept of tying healing to the dodge mechanics. Even the restoration healing spell was actually an absorb spell that converted damage taken into healing. The player could still freeze time to potion spam in a menu, but potions were limited, so it was best to use a dodge ability for free HP whenever possible, and top up on health outside of combat by gorging on questionable food items scattered throughout the dungeons. Character builds were heavily pushed towards hybrid spell swords. Specializing had the potential to backfire if and when the player ran up against enemies that were resistant or outright immune to whatever the build was specialized in. In theory, they could have used poisons to make enemies weaker to whatever elements the player wanted to use. However, poisons had very short durations and would have to be reapplied in subsequent fights, which would obviously drain the player's poison inventory very quickly. Normally, I'd resent being forced into a specific playstyle in an Elder Scrolls game. However, Blades at least picked the most interesting character build from Skyrim to force me into. As well, with resistances and weaknesses being so prominent, it actually made what kind of spell sword I spec'd into more than just what spell color I wanted to splash in combat. Most of the time I was going for the classic fire/longsword build, stacking as many enchantments and abilities as I could that synergized with that, and getting to enjoy melting my enemies. Then I'd run up against a Daedra dungeon and get stomped, which forced me to switch to my backup Frost loadout. And that's just one example. Sometimes I needed poison damage, sometimes I needed lightning protection. All of these things meant that there was always room to improve, always something that I could optimize better. Some dungeons would be a breeze no matter what, others would require me to get a little sweaty and bust out the optimized loadouts. This is the sad part of Blades as a game. There was a genuinely good combat system here that was just tragically tied to a shitty mobile game that was built with forced obsolescence in mind. It's a shame I had to write this entire section in past tense because the game is no longer playable. Sure, Blades wasn't a great game. That was almost entirely owed to the platform it was restricted to. I'm imagining a timeline where Blades was a single-player dungeon crawler on traditional platforms. Maybe something with more fleshed out character builds, a bigger town, more elaborate quests, and dungeons that could actually be explored. I'm left to wonder if it was even financially worth it to make Blades a ticking time bomb with artificial points of friction meant to milk a few whales, as opposed to making a game with more artistic merit that people could and would want to play for 10 plus years.
But why was Blades murdered? Money. Let's dive in. As far as I can tell, the reason this game wasn't just ported into a single-player format and released on stuff like Steam is that the microtransactions were fundamental to the business model. and by the time the subject of sunsetting the servers came around, there were a few main issues. The main thing seems to be that player account information is centralized to stop players from cheating to give themselves currency, and they simply don't want to pay someone to detangle that core functionality. The first question is, who at Bethesda remembers the initial development and can untangle the accounts from the server? That way, players could still level up and progress without needing to ever log in. Second, do those people even care? And if someone else cares, do they have the skill set to do it? The third, will the company pay to untangle it and make Blades single player? Will they do it for free? And if not, do they think there is an audience that will pay for it? If there is, then why not abandon Blades anyways in favor of making a new game? All of the free market logic works against preserving Blades, and that's assuming there isn't some other legal complication behind the scenes. Without adequate planning early into development for what will happen when the game servers are set to be taken offline, it was inevitably doomed. What can you do? Well, a lot actually. This is where Stop Killing Games steps in. At first, this appeared to be a European initiative, but it has gained ground in California recently. As of writing, it's passed the California State Assembly, but it still needs to pass through the Senate, so there's no telling if it will survive or ever be effective. Regardless, the idea is that if legally, game companies are not allowed to release a game and then later randomly take it offline without some form of update to access functionality, then game developers can start projects from the outset with this restraint in mind. The restraint being how games were already being made until the 2010s. In other words, if the regulation was in place when Blades had started development, then when it came time to turn off the servers, the groundwork would have already been laid for making the game accessible offline, even if the main developers who worked on it had left the company at that point. It's a hell of a lot easier to build the foundation for a house if you do it before you build the house itself. Of course, ZeniMax would never voluntarily do this, as I'm going to spend this section highlighting just how greedy they were with Blades. Blades is far from a model example of games that would have been hurt by regulations. Stop Killing Games would have done nothing about the greed problem, it just would have made sure you'd get to keep your game when ZeniMax was done robbing the players. There is one wrinkle, since the game was free to play, and those might not necessarily be covered by regulations unless microtransactions end up being covered as well. So, what was worth tying the game to a central server so badly that the game had to be doomed to death? What great features were added that necessitated making this a disposable game? What amazing online interactivity, emergent gameplay, story system was necessary? Let's talk microtransactions. It's pretty standard. You have a normal currency in gold that accrues rapidly from most actions, then you have a premium currency, which is used to supplement missing resources, speed up the timer on some actions that can range from minutes to days, and purchase certain other microtransactions. This is the medium currency between your wallet and the digital items, so that ZeniMax can obfuscate both the prices of the items and the legal ownership rights you might have to them if you had bought them directly. As a courtesy, Bethesda reduced the microtransaction prices to 1 per and gave 50,000 of this currency in light of the imminent shutdown. I started spending gems before I looked up what the initial exchange rate was, and I was shocked when I looked up the original prices, to say the least. Put your guesses down for how much money I would have spent if the chests had been full price. So there's resources you need to collect to build up a town, as well as craft items, and progression to gather those resources through the gameplay. Say you need 160 lumber to start upgrading a house. You could go out to dungeons where you will find one at a time every once in a while, or if you're lucky, you get a quest that awards a bulk amount. Or you can pay 1 gem per missing lumber. So you have a choice, spend an hour grinding, or spend some real-world cash to speed up the process. 160 gems was equivalent to $3. There were bulk schemes to buy tons of currency, which is a double-edged sword. You can be tempted to spend a small amount as a one-off, but if you ever buy gems again, you'll miss out on the bulk benefit. Or you might buy more than you ever need, and then stop playing with unspent gems, in which case you gave them money for nothing. I mean, it's all basically nothing. There's really nothing here. It's buying permission from Bethesda to progress faster. And the progression is scaling, so early on it's not too bad. You will easily keep up with the resource demands and timers will Only be a couple minutes. Just go run some dungeons, maybe go for a walk in real life, and then it'll be done. It only gets more and more absurd the longer you play. Of course, you can find gems in the game. They can be in chests or other loot containers, or drop off of enemies. They could be quest or challenge or event rewards. Often not many. I think in a few hours of playing I had earned maybe under 200 total. I noticed the final timers were over days, and those cost something like 800 gems to skip. And all of this is not counting if you're saving up your good boy points for shop items. Gems can also be used to purchase more inventory space, reallocate your skills and attributes, change your appearance, or create guilds. But it's a free game, so naturally they have to make money somehow. I mean, the reason to make money are the servers, and the servers exist so players can't cheat in gems, but the gems are there to pay for the servers. Duh. It's a solution created by ZeniMax for a problem they invented in the first place. The core of what you actually play is kilobytes of information storing variables on how many resources you have. Anytime someone defends this, they are getting into arguments about a company's ability to afford hosting files less than the size of a picture. And the most critical part is that none of this is essential for the game's design. As in, you could remove gems completely, and Blades for the most part would be the same game, just slightly more tedious. How absurd was it though? Well, there are chests you can buy, 3 tiers of increasing value, with the highest tier of legendary chest having the potential to contain artifact items. In an Elder Scrolls context, these are obviously going to be stuff like the Mace of Molag Bal or the Savior's Hide. Again, you can find them in the world if you play for long enough, but thankfully, there are loot boxes. I started spamming loot boxes for building materials so I could level up the town faster, and I accrued a few artifacts from random chance. Well, the legendary loot boxes are 2,500 gems. They would usually contain around 15,000 gold, a couple high quality but generic items, and a splash of crafting materials. I figured these things might have fetched $5 or $10 back in the day. No. 2,500 gems was equivalent to $31. There was a big spender who estimated that you would get an artifact in maybe 1 in 25 chests. Even at the highest conversion rate, which is 14,000 gems for $160, you would have to spend $800 to get the gems necessary for a run of 25 loot boxes, with no guarantee of an artifact. For reference, in Overwatch, you could get 24 loot boxes for $20. And I definitely think that's a low number. At least when I was spamming loot boxes, I was definitely doing a lot worse than an artifact every 1 in 25 boxes. So I estimate that in about 4 hours, I bought around $30,000 in microtransactions before I had looked up how much they cost when they were full price. I obviously didn't spend a penny on them as I was spending the stipend I was given, but goddamn was it a realization. I kinda knew I was being excessive when I made the touchscreen equivalent of keybinds to speed up opening chests, but I had no idea how little value they gave players for their money. Here's a funny value: assuming 1 gem is scaled back up to the price of a legendary chest, they gave players enough currency to buy $1.4 million in loot boxes. Anyways, since the progression slows down the further in you get, the more pressure to spend real money for in-game benefits will be placed on the game's most loyal players, with the most sunk cost in the game. You know, the ones who will emphatically defend Blades no matter what. Players who are new will see the friction points but not yet experience the pressure to buy in. I do think the sloppiness aspect of the game is very obvious from the outset. Nobody is being tricked into thinking this is an actual Elder Scrolls game. There's a flashy animation for opening chests and a literal flashing animation when you buy resource packs, like avert your eyes when you see it. There's login bonuses, deals of the day, deals when you level up the town to buy more resources for construction, all elements that sell the sleaziness of the Blades microtransactions experience. But really, that's the mobile market as a whole. When they announced they were shutting down Blades, they also tried to delist it from everywhere. So instead of encouraging people to check out this game at the last possible opportunity before it would be gone potentially forever, they made it more difficult. You couldn't buy it for the Switch anymore, and the Google Play Store page was gone. This initially made it hard to install since the Android emulator I was using relies on the Play Store to actually find the game. It was kinda uncanny. It knew there was a game called Blades that existed, and it even had art for it, but trying to click on that image didn't do anything. The only reason we were able to get our hands on it after the shutdown announcement to make this video was that you can install the Android package file directly and then get the updates. I'm not sure we had any recourse if we did want to check out the higher fidelity Switch version. I obviously don't own a Switch, nor do I know anybody who does and already had purchased Blades and had it installed, and even if I did, I don't know if you can restart a character to see the early game. And yeah, this just led to more nightmares. There isn't really a good Android emulator out there. Half of them are either spyware or adware. The one I used is decent, but had been abandoned for at least 2 years. You also need a Google account to play, so I made one to play this game that got suspended after 4 hours for suspected botting. And yes, a suspended Google account meant I could no longer play Elder Scrolls Blades. Maybe I could have if I connected to the Bethesda.net account, because that was something I was asked to do as well. Google accepted my appeal after 24 hours so I could finish spamming loot boxes and building the town. That is better than the alternative that they nuke my account and then the other linked accounts to it. It would be funny for content to get my YouTube channel banned because I was spamming loot boxes in a game that was actively being killed. This is probably a pretty clear clue on why this game is the way it is. Mobile gaming came about during an era when gaming was already being plundered for all of its fiscal value. Developers quickly started using the term whale to refer to players who would spend large sums of money on these games. Blades was not designed for millions of people to play like Skyrim is. Blades was designed to slowly filter people out until a hardened core of big spenders was left that would regularly drop large sums of money on microtransactions. And once those people moved on to other whaling games, Blades was to be shut down and forgotten. There's really no technical reason Blades couldn't transition to PC, purely a business reason. Bethesda really likes their walled garden ecosystems. Look at the Creation Club as an example. To them, it doesn't seem to matter that Starfield's modding scene is a fraction the size it could have been. As long as the whales keep buying creations, they're happy. Mobile is a platform where not only do customers lack rights, but the concept of customers having rights is a foreign idea. With console and PC gaming, there are still shining examples of the era when you could buy games and own them forever, where the business model was companies making the best games they could and being rewarded with box product sales. In that time period, game companies lived and died on quality. Today, quality is not a factor, only what kind of live services that you can show the investors. How mobile gaming works now is what game studios want for the rest of the industry. There's just pesky things in the way, like regulations and software and customer expectations. Even on mobile, that whole Android package thing I did is called side loading, rather than just installing a program, and Google has been looking for ways to crack down on it. We only ever got that amenity as a means for developers to create new apps for them. It was never meant to be a way to own software on your phone, if it even is really your phone. Down the line, I want to make a video talking about how arbitrary the distinction is between ownership of pretty much everything in our lives and ownership of software, which is treated as distinct because the software publishers want you to think it's magic that exists in some other ethereal plane of reality, when really software companies just include tons of jargon and layers of abstraction to obfuscate the subject in order to get away with business practices that every other company wishes they could do. But yeah, that's the how and why of Blades' death. One of the main problems Stop Killing Games has experienced is the reality that many games that die were not very good. And so most people just don't care. Destiny 2 is dying soon, and even though people swear it was good at one time or another, the state it is in at the end of its life is not. They ran it into the ground so hard that now few people even care that it's going away. This really isn't a business practice we should have to tolerate, and we don't even really need new legislation to make it go away. The existing laws we have on the books would cover it if various governments didn't keep deciding that video games arbitrarily don't have the same rules we already have applied to them. And it's not something that's fixed by campaigning to fix consumer habits. There are enough people who will play games like Blades when it's new without any consideration for end of life and allow themselves to get fleeced. You voting with your wallet? They don't care. You're already priced in. There's no free market correction. We're seeing what a lack of regulation does to a creative industry as we speak. Just look at the state of gaming in 2026. I like old games of bad quality. It's fun to go back and see what those games were about. But people in a few years are not going to get that same luxury with games made after 2010. More and more bad games are disappearing and people won't get to experience them retroactively because they were designed to be disposable for short-term profits. There's probably a game that you would really like but you'll never get to play because it's dead. Even if Blades does make a return down the line, whether Bethesda decides to release a single-player version or it is somehow revived by miracle modders, there are many games that are going to be gone forever. And we are limited in our abilities as consumers to simply vote with our wallet. If we want a better industry, we're going to have to be a little more active with stopping this from happening. When you see a live service game get announced, publicly ask, really make yourself a nuisance. Ask them, what is the end-of-life plan? If you leave a review on a live service game, knock off points if there's no announced end-of-life plan. Avoid live service games unless the developer has announced an end-of-life plan. These are small things you can do as an average consumer to try to push back. But the big thing is to be vocal about supporting legislation that forces software to be regulated in the same ways any good or product would be. Thanks for watching. I decided last minute to do a short project about this soon-to-be-killed game while I still had the chance to. Though I do want to say I wouldn't rely on this being a feature about my channel. If ESO is killed before I get around to talking about it, sucks to be an ESO dev, I guess.